congratulations on
Oh,
Sound of Metal, because it's a really powerful piece of work, and it's your first feature film as well as a director.
it is. It is
What a
indeed.
way
I
to
noticed that.
start.
Yeah, it's been a long journey to get here, you know. So and really, you know, I started dreaming of my film career when I was about 19 years old, and I never wanted to do anything but direct a fiction feature, and it's just taken me this long.
So how did the story come about? Because I believe that Darius Marder was involved in some way, and of course you wrote the script for The Place Beyond the Pines for him.
Right. Well, yeah, Derek's really in the fiber of this story, and he's a dear friend of mine. But when we met 13 years ago, within the first minute of meeting each other, we were talking about this doc that he was shooting. I was finishing a documentary of my own at that time, and we both were. We found ourselves talking about this doc he was shooting, which was these metal band called Jucifer, and there were a man and a woman, a couple in relationship on the stage playing the loudest damn music you've ever heard in your life. It was like a wall of sound. And we both got, we were just so lit up, you know, just talking about this. We had this real palpable connection. And Derek got caught into making Blue Valentine at the time. And I finished my doc, and I kind of took some of this footage that he was shooting, and I started recognizing this, what I'm calling POH, this point of hearing. And you know, I started recognizing this potential for this cinematic potential for this very highly empathic language that might be possible of you know, that we see in Sound of Metal now, that we hear in Sound of Metal. But all those many years ago, as I was cutting that footage, I started to kind of play with this, and then I realized, you know, Derek asked me if I wanted to finish the film, the doc he was making. I said, no, I don't. I want to write this thing. I have to write this thing. So I started writing it, you know, many years ago, and eventually took my brother on board. But yeah, that's how it started.
So how did you go about choosing your cast for Sound of Metal, particularly Riz and Olivia, because their roles are so crucial and they're so demanding as well?
God, it's true. Yeah, I was just talking to my brother yesterday, and we were recounting how many pages we wrote to create these characters. So many pages that aren't in the script. You know, we wrote, like, Lou was very important to us. Lou, we always knew Lou had to be so specific and so strong as a character that she would be present through the whole movie. You know, that because in many ways that's what Ruben is trading everything in for. You know, we think he's trading it for his hearing, but maybe it's Lou. And so, you know, it was a very tough bit of casting, and it took me 4 or 5 years to cast the project, and that's for a lot of reasons. Because number one, I was really scaring the hell out of actors, every actor I met, just to
What
see
were
if they
you
were
doing?
well. I knew that if actors weren't up for it, I had to see it. I had to know it. You don't want to find out later. So this is a scary process. That's what it is, and it needs to be. And if it isn't a scary process, it's the wrong movie for you. But if you're not up for it, I want to know. So you know, I would do that. I had an incredibly high bar for what I wanted an actor to do for this role. And if they weren't willing to do it, I didn't want them. And I actually did, you know, I did turn away quite a few versions of this movie that were, you know, immediately financeable, but they didn't have that quality. They didn't have that degree of commitment. And so finding Riz was really one of those wonderful things, because I didn't even know who he was as an actor prior to that. Once someone mentioned him to me, and then I went and watched the night of, and I was like, man, this guy sure has talent. But I still wasn't sure what he was made of. You know, I didn't understand him yet as a person. So, but when I sat down with him, you know, he had read the script. I sat down with him. I looked into his eyes. I challenged him in a number of ways, and I offered him the role halfway through lunch. You know, I knew it, and I think I saw something in him that was hungry, and I saw an artist. I saw integrity. I saw someone who was brave. I saw someone who was willing to maybe lose control and perhaps access something as an actor that they had never accessed before. And that's really exciting to me. I know those performances throughout history. When I see an actor of the kind of talent that Riz is, when I see an actor unlock something in themselves, those are some of the most exciting cinematic moments that I've ever experienced in my life. So I had this palpable feeling like this guy has those things to unlock here, and he's willing to go on the journey. It might yield fruit.
I've got to ask you about one other member of the cast, and that's Paul Raci, who plays Joe. And I wondered if that part was actually written with him in mind, because there seem to be so many parallels between Joe and Paul.
It was written with him in mind, but I hadn't met him yet.
It was obviously meant to be then.
I mean, truly, how do you explain it? It's so crazy. I mean, look, he was written as a veteran. He was written as an addict. He was written from deaf culture. Yeah. And, you know, Paul is a 2-time Vietnam veteran. He's a former addict. He's lived this life, and he's culturally deaf. And by that, I mean, he's from deaf culture. He's not deaf, and he's not hearing. He's a coda. He's a child of deaf adults. And
he's a sign language interpreter as well, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a sign language. Well, ASL is Paul's first language. He didn't speak English at all until he was 6. Yeah, and you know, it's an interesting thing in this film, because we as hearing people, we don't really understand that deaf culture isn't doesn't just correlate with the physicality of deafness. Deaf culture is something that, like, if I go deaf tomorrow, I'm not culturally deaf, you know? And so this is really interesting. The character of Joe is not culturally deaf. So Paul has more cultural deafness than Joe as a character does. Paul does, because Paul was raised and grew up in deaf culture. That's his culture. And so interestingly, as he took on that role, he, in his wisdom, actually had to dumb down the ASL for the role of Joe, because Joe didn't grow up with it. So Paul's is signing in a very specific way that he knows Joe would have signed, having only learned it when he was maybe 25 or 30. So, you know, it's a fascinating degree of specificity. I really appreciate that in Paul, but Paul is more culturally deaf than Joe. It's really amazing.
He's extraordinary.
And it was an impossible role. It was an impossible role to cast. It was a miracle that we found each other. And but what's also really amazing about him is he's been acting for 40 years. So it was like finding this artist. He's such an actor. He's really a finely tuned artist. So he has chops, and he brought them. And it's not just that he's like Joe. You know, you don't really deliver those scenes like he's doing. Just because you're like the character. That doesn't work that way. He's really special, Paul is.
It's like J.K. Simmons said, you know, an overnight sensation at 60.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's
exactly
what he's like. Have you actually been able to see the film with an audience and see how they respond to the captioning, and particularly a deaf audience?
I have, and actually, the first group of people I ever screened the movie for was an all-deaf audience in Brooklyn. We rented a theater, and I really wanted the deaf community to see this film first, and I wanted to know very purely, without any critics or any noise or anything else, what did it feel like? And it was a scary moment. You know, I had been working with the deaf community very closely all along for many, many years. But that moment was just, you know, what's it going to be like?
That's your acid test, really, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it was a very interesting moment. And then after that, I opened up. So Lauren Ridloff was there, and all these many people, and opened up a conversation with with the deaf community around the movie, what it felt like, what the captions felt like, all of it. And then I made changes as it related to that conversation. And so yes, I had that, but then I actually got lucky also because, you know, it's an amazing thing now. I didn't know how lucky I was at the time, but you know, I premiered at Toronto, um, not this past year, but the year before. And so I screened the film with open captions, as it was always going to be screened in any theater, um, with a very large hearing audience and a very large deaf audience in the theater. So it was 1,000+ people, and it was extraordinary because it really did simulate this cross-cultural experience that I was dreaming about. And the way that that looked and felt was this: you're watching this movie, and all of a sudden you hear an eruption of laughter from a portion of the audience, and all of these hearing people looking around going, what the fuck? And, and you know, for once the
Yeah.
hearing audience is the minority,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and the deaf audience is luxuriating in their own language, which they never get to do in most films. And then um and then, you know, there were moments of emotion that they understood the nuance of, and you would hear gasps or cries come out of the deaf audience, again because it's not uh, you know, there aren't boundaries of how you express emotion all the time. So it was just wonderful. I mean, it really was this cross-cultural experience, and I didn't realize it was one of the only times I would have that with this film, but it was incredibly it's a precious memory.
Well, I really hope you get the same sort of response when it comes out in the UK, because it's a tremendous film. It really is. And thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. I wish I had more time to talk to you, but I don't.
Oh,
So
it's such a
thank
pleasure.
you.
Well, thanks so much. I appreciate your kind words. Thank you.
Thank you.